Mr. President, under President Biden's leadership, the United States has experienced an unprecedented border crisis. That's not exactly news, because for the last 2.5 years, Customs and Border Protection has encountered more than 5.2 million migrants at the border, plus another 1.5 million gotaways. In other words, under our bizarre and broken immigration system, 5.2 million people basically were welcomed at the border, while another 1.5 million simply fled the Border Patrol and made their way into the interior of the United States. Now, it is true, out of the 5.2 million under Title 42, the COVID-19 order, basically public health order, that 2.6 million of the 5.2 were returned to their country of origin, or at least expelled out of the United States. That was a public health order, but that's gone. That's expired. That's served its time. So under any scenario, you can conclude that under President Biden's tenure, millions of people have made their way into the United States, not using the legal pathways that are designed to make our immigration system safe, orderly, and humane, something that I know we all support, legal immigration. Instead, President Biden's failures when it comes to border policy has resulted in transnational criminal organizations controlling immigration. And they also control the drug trafficking that makes their way across the border. And as was acknowledged by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, when he was testifying before the Judiciary Committee, I believe he said he understood that this was part of the business model of these organizations, these criminal organizations. They would flood the border with people, and as the Border Patrol was diverted to try to deal with that mass of humanity, including unaccompanied children, that left huge gaps in the border, which were then exploited by the drug cartels to move drugs into the interior of the United States. Rather than secure the border or make any attempt to deter illegal immigration, the Biden administration has allowed the chaos to continue for nearly 2.5 years. Now, inexplicably, the president claims this is all part of his plan to promote safe, orderly, and humane migration. But there's nothing safe about the journey migrants take to the United States in the hands of cartels, coyotes, and ordinary criminals. There's nothing orderly about migrants using inflatable rafts and ropes to cross the Rio Grande, where some meet their death when they drown. And there's nothing humane about what's happening in the United States now as a result of the border crisis. First, let's look at what happens to the children. Since President Biden took office, more than 300,000 unaccompanied children have been encountered at the border and then placed with a sponsor in the interior of the United States. To be clear, these children did not arrive in the United States with their parents. These children make the dangerous journey north with basically any adult who's willing to convey them from their home across the border into the United States. But the truth is, these children are not unaccompanied. They are accompanied by the criminals who make this their business. The sad reality is that many come to the United States in the care of cartels, human smugglers, and coyotes, and parents pay smugglers thousands of dollars to bring their children to the United States. I have no doubt that when those children reached the United States, their parents thought they would be safe. After all, this is the greatest country in the world, a country that values freedom, justice, and opportunity. I'm sure their parents expected they would live safe and happy lives while their asylum claims are being considered. But we know the ugly truth. We know now that countless children have experienced a new hell right here in the United States. The New York Times, for example, published 2 bombshell investigative reports detailing widespread exploitation of migrant children here in our country. Some children are being forced to work in meat packing plants, food processing facilities, and construction jobs. Underage children. These are not part-time jobs after school. These are full-time jobs instead of going to school, in violation of many states' child labor laws. They're being treated as indentured servants as they try to pay off the debts they owe to the traffickers who brought them here. And there's no question the Biden administration understands what's going on. And yes, their silence is complicity. Once unaccompanied children are apprehended and processed at the border, the Department of Health and Human Services has the legal responsibility to place these children with a safe sponsor. According to longstanding policy, the agent follows up with a phone call 30 days later to make sure that the child is safe. On both counts, the pre-placement vetting and the post-placement wellness check, the Biden administration has completely fumbled its responsibilities. Health and Human Services actually loosened the vetting requirements in order to get children out of shelters as fast as possible, with little regard for the increased danger to these children. The New York Times has documented that at least 85,000 of those 300,000 children cannot even be reached within 30 days. So the practice is to make a wellness call in 30 days, but 85,000 of those 300,000 children, there's no answer. So the Biden administration can't tell you where these children are, whether they're being fed, whether they're going to school, whether they're being neglected or abused or forced into involuntary labor. President Biden's administration doesn't know. And I think the sad truth is they don't care. Because if they did care, this would not be allowed to continue. This isn't breaking news. This isn't something I'm announcing here today for the first time. 2 major investigative pieces by the New York Times has exposed this scandal. Over the last couple of years, the Department of Health and Human Services has received countless warnings that these children are endangered. Those warnings came through its own hotline, government contractors, and scores of employees who sounded the alarm. Not only did Health and Human Services ignore the warnings of whistleblowers that tried to silence them, department leadership retaliated against employees who shined a light on this massive abuse. As a result, countless children have remained in dangerous situations just so the administration could avoid an embarrassing PR headache. As we know, the tens of thousands of migrant children who've been lost, literally lost, by the Biden administration are not the only victims of the border crisis. You know, I sometimes ask myself, what's it going to take? How bad are things going to have to get before this situation registers with enough people of good conscience and goodwill that they're actually willing to do something about it? And I'm constantly disappointed that in spite of this scandal, we can't find enough people of goodwill and good intentions here in the United States Senate to change this, to make it better, to throw a rescue line to these kids. But the story gets worse. We know the fentanyl epidemic has killed more than 70,000 people a year in the United States just last year, making it the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 49, the leading cause of death. We know that the fentanyl epidemic does not discriminate. It kills young people, it kills old people, it kills rich people, it kills poor people, both those living in major cities and those living in rural America. And we know the overwhelming majority of this fentanyl comes across the U.S.-Mexico border. Again, this is not breaking news. This is something known to all of us, including the Biden administration. We also know where the precursor chemicals come from. These are chemicals shipped from China, shipped to Mexico, where the drug cartels mix them up. They use industrial-sized pill presses to gin out hundreds of thousands of pills that are contaminated with fentanyl. Now, most of the time, people who get poisoned by fentanyl don't actually know they're taking fentanyl. They may think they're taking a Xanax or a Percocet or some other more innocuous medication, something we'd prefer our kids not to take, but we understand sometimes that happens. But they have no idea that a tiny dose of fentanyl can kill them, and that many of these pills ginned out by the drug cartels using these precursor chemicals in Mexico are then shipped across the border and unfortunately routinely take the lives of young, bright children who have the best of their life ahead of them. Between October of last year and April of this year, Customs and Border Protection seized more than 12,000 pounds of fentanyl at the southern border. Again, if you have a pencil, and I don't have a pencil, but I have a pen, it's basically the part of the pen that sticks out of the end of the part you hold on to. It takes that little amount of fentanyl to kill you. And last year, Customs and Border Protection seized 17,000 pounds of it. Now, some people say, well, that's great. We don't have a problem. The Border Patrol seized it. Well, you remember those gotaways I mentioned earlier? More than 1 million of them. They were running away from law enforcement, and I guarantee you it was for a reason. Either they knew that their criminal record and background would not make it possible for them to legally migrate in the United States, or they were carrying drugs like this fentanyl. And we know a lot of it's getting through because we're seeing the devastation that it has wrought. Again, with 71,000 fentanyl-related deaths last year alone. So we know CBP isn't able to interdict every ounce of illicit drugs. Far from it. Over the past couple of years, the unprecedented border crisis under the Biden administration has affected all of our missions at the border, including those that have nothing to do with immigration. Law enforcement has been shifted to the front lines in order to process and care for the migrants. Instead of stopping dangerous drugs and criminals, many agents are pushing paper and changing diapers. No one is happier with this situation than the drug cartels and the criminals who smuggle migrants for money. They're getting rich. What's not to love from their standpoint? With fewer agents on the front line, they have a clear and easy path to move fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and other deadly drugs into the United States. And our communities are being ravaged by the overdose epidemic. And the administration has given the cartels clear and easy corridors to traffic even more of their poison into the United States, as I've described. Well, this is hardly a picture of a humane response to the border crisis, as President Biden and his administration claim. This is not humane. Well, as I've said earlier, Mr. President, sometimes I ask myself, what will it take? What will it take to get the attention of the people who actually have the authority to change this, to make it better, to save lives? Because hearing about these crises is enough to make your blood boil. The administration cut corners in order to place migrant children with sponsors. It exerted minimal effort to follow up with those children to ensure that they're safe and healthy. At the same time, the chaos caused by the border crisis has led to a security breakdown, which enables fentanyl and other dangerous drugs to pour into the United States, killing Americans, 108,000 last year alone. Despite the widespread suffering caused by the Biden administration policies, the president and his senior officials just don't seem to care. They don't care. If they did care, they would do something about it. So it's clear to me they don't care. There's a clear need to secure the border and stop the unprecedented migration crisis, but the majority of our Democratic colleagues refuse to address the border crisis unless Congress passes what they call comprehensive immigration reform. So, in other words, they're holding these children, they're holding the rest of the country hostage in order to achieve a legislative goal which they know is not possible. One, because we have a divided government, a Republican-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Democrat sitting in the White House. There's no question that America's immigration system is in need of modernization. It's outdated, it's inefficient, and crippled by backlogs. But as everyone knows, immigration reform is a very, very difficult, thorny issue. For 2 years, our Democratic colleagues controlled all three branches of government. And they couldn't even pass a partisan immigration bill. And now that we're operating in divided government, that calculus becomes harder, not easier. There is absolutely zero chance that the Democrat-led Senate and the Republican-led House will be able to reach an agreement on immigration reform anytime soon. I wish that were not true. It doesn't have to be true, but I think unless attitudes change, that's a fact. Still, this elusive idea of comprehensive immigration reform has become the holdup for other problems relating to the border and immigration. In other words, these emergencies occurring at the border are being held hostage to an impossible goal, which is passing bipartisan immigration reform as a demand for solving these other problems. Right now, the major problem we need to address is the humanitarian crisis fallout from what's happening. We can't prolong the suffering caused by the border crisis while our Democratic colleagues try to build support for a massive immigration reform bill that many of them seem to have zero interest in. Because if they had interest, then I assume they would be rolling up their sleeves and doing the hard work, doing more than just talking about it. For example, in the Senate, the Democrat chairman of the Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction to mark up and presumably pass, with some combination of Republican and Democratic votes, a bill to address the crisis that I mentioned. The Democratic majority leader has the authority to bring a bill to the floor, to open it to amendments so that all senators can participate, to try to find out if there is some path forward and some consensus. But in the 2 years our Democratic colleagues controlled all three branches of government, they did zero about it. That means that the young adults who are in a box because of deferred action on childhood arrivals, this is an an illegal scheme that President Obama did unilaterally 10 years ago that's been tied up in litigation ever since and is likely to be held illegal by a court of last resort here very soon. So trying to address that, trying to address the drug crisis, trying to protect these 300,000 children, all of that is being held hostage for our Democratic colleagues to pursue an unattainable goal, given the current political environment. Migrant children are being abused within our own borders. Drugs killed about 109,000 Americans a year. We cannot leverage these lives for unrelated and unattainable measures. There's nothing safe, orderly, or humane about the Biden administration's response to the border crisis. And until something changes, more people will continue to suffer and die. Mr. President, I yield the floor.